Time to ask some basic fundamental questions about Islam. Questions that, frankly, others in Canada, in fact, in the USA and the West in general, are simply reluctant, even frightened to ask. Now, Robert Spencer is the founder of Jihad Watch, and he asked these questions, and he joins me now from New Hampshire. Welcome back to you, my friend.
Happy to be here, Michael. Thank you.
And I want to say this. We were chatting before the break, and I asked, we're going to be in Toronto in the near future, and you said, well, no one has invited me up. I think of all the third-rate people who are asked to speak up here for all sorts of large fees, and they've got nothing original to say. You're one of the most important voices out there. So anyone watching right now, contact this man, give him a huge amount of money, fly him to Toronto, and we can have him actually live in the studio. You've just finished your latest book, which is called Did Muhammad Exist?
Yes, that's right. Just sent it into the publisher, ISI, yesterday, and it'll be out in the spring.
Did he? Did he exist?
He probably did, but everything that we know about him is legend. He's kind of like Robin Hood, who probably existed, but he probably was not somebody who took from the rich and gave to the poor and lived in Sherwood Forest with Friar Tuck. That's all just made-up stories, and so it is with Muhammad. We know nothing about him for fully 60 years after he is supposed to have died. There's absolutely nothing in the records of either the Arab conquerors or the people they conquered about the conquests happened, but neither the conquerors nor the conquered ever mentioned Islam or Muhammad or Quran. None of those things existed up to that for 60 years after Muhammad's supposed time of death.
Now, if any bright spark out there is saying, oh, well, the same applies to Jesus. Actually, I'm just finishing a book now, last few weeks, called Heresy, Great Lies About Christianity. This idea that did Jesus exist? No serious scholar would ask that. There's overwhelming non-Christian pagan writing and evidence that Jesus existed. We know, you might not think he was the Messiah, I think you're wrong, but there's overwhelming evidence for that. But you're saying that there's a 60-year hiatus, and there's just no mention of a man who was apparently so important to the culture.
Yeah, you're quite right, Michael. The analogy is very good because there are all sorts of non-Christians who speak about Jesus and about the Christians in the early decades after the time of Jesus' life. But with Muhammad's life, in the decades after he's supposed to have lived, there's this huge silence. And it's really a very strange silence because the Arabs were certainly pouring out of Arabia and conquering the Middle East and North Africa, India, Persia, Spain. And in all that time, they don't say anything about Muhammad. The people who conquered them never call them Muslims. They call them Saracens or Hagarians or Mujahirun, but never Muslims. And they never have any idea, they show no hint that these people are coming with a book, a prophet, a new religion.
Interesting. Now, when I mentioned the comparison with Jesus, I think what is fascinating to construe from this is that we can say in any Christian-based country Jesus didn't exist. We can say the most repugnant, vile things, actually, and nothing's going to happen. Could you, in any country with a majority Islamic population, could you write a book saying, did Muhammad exist? Could you question whether he existed at all? Would you be allowed to?
Well, I'll tell you, there is a gentleman, Suleiman Bashir. He's dead now, but he was a courageous scholar in actually the West Bank and at the University of Nablus, and he actually posited to his students a few years back that the Quran was the product of historical development, which is something I discuss in my new book, and his students threw him out the window. They had no patience for this kind of thing, and his life was under threat for the scholarly investigations that he had undertaken.
He merely said that a sacred text to Muslims, the Quran, was a product of historical development, which is said about the Bible all the time. And they threw him out of the window, and now he's dead.
Yes, quite right, exactly. And Bart Ehrman, who's a New Testament scholar who says that none of it happened and so on, I have a video up at Jihad Watch just today. Somebody asks him, so when are you going to start your scholarly study of the Quran? And he says, when I no longer value my life. And really, you know, everybody takes for granted that if you start asking these kinds of historical questions, which are simply matters of history and matters of fact about Islam and the Quran and Muhammad, then you're taking your life into your hands.
You see, the first part of this equation, it is true. We know it to be true that there's a difference in cultures, a difference in the way religion is treated and life respected. But we can say that, we look at mainstream TV, we look at the PBSs and the CBCs and the BBCs, they're telling us a completely different picture. They're saying all religions are the same, all peoples are the same, and pretty much all religion is bad, but we don't want to say much about Islam. Are they dishonest? Are they cowardly? Do they really believe this nonsense?
I think they to some degree really believe it. They will insist that all religions, as you say, all religions are sort of bad. But really, Islam is not as bad as the others. Islam is a religion of peace and tolerance that's been hijacked by extremists, but those extremists aren't really as bad as the Christian ones, and so on. And yet, if they really know, if you start talking to mainstream media reporters, I remember a few years back that I was talking to one about one of my other books, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam, and how it wasn't being carried in some bookstores in California. And he said, well, yeah, because they know that if they carry it, they'll get blown up. And I thought, well, if you know that, then you know Islam's not a religion of peace. You know that what I'm saying in the book is actually true. But the paradox was lost on him.
Susan Sarandon, I mean, I don't want to labour this point, but I think it is worth emphasising to people watching. Susan Sarandon, I mean, she's an actress, who cares really, but she has just said to a captive audience that the Pope is a Nazi. The Pope, a man who was forced to join the Hitler Youth, he left the German military as quickly as possible, put his life on the line. His father was a police officer who resisted Nazism, but because he was German, he's a Nazi. Now, she says that, she's an idiot, she can say whatever she wants. But would this great liberal campaigner stand there and say, I don't know, Muhammad, if he existed, had sex with very young girls. He believed in slaughter. He believed in ethnic cleansing. Do you think she'd say that?
Well, no, she wouldn't, and yet the records are rather forthright. You know, Michael, you mentioned the sex with children, and Muhammad, according to the earliest Islamic sources, he had sex with a 9-year-old when he was 54, and she became his favorite wife. Now, that's pretty straightforward in the sources, and I'm questioning the historical value of the sources, but the sources still say what they say. And the reality is that child marriage is something that's taken for granted all around the Islamic world, and is given the sanction of the Prophet's example. But if you talk about it in the wrong context, then yes, once again, you're taking your life into your hands.
When we hear the criticism, well, these things do seem difficult to understand, but it was the ancient world, and if you look at the Old Testament, which is much earlier, of course, but if you look at the Old Testament, that there are similar examples of repugnant behavior. Does any of that really apply? Is it authentic criticism?
No, it's actually a false analogy. The Old Testament is full of violent behavior and immoral behavior, but it is never called upon to those who believe in the Old Testament to imitate that violent behavior. It's said, and this has been problematic for Jewish and Christian biblical scholars throughout history, that God told Joshua to clear out whole cities and so on. But never does it say, you go and imitate Joshua and clear out whole cities. Whereas the Quran is very clear that it is the responsibility of believers as a whole in the aggregate to make war against unbelievers and to subjugate them under the rule of Islamic law. And that is mainstream Islamic teaching among the sects, that it's the responsibility of the Muslim community to wage war against unbelievers and to subjugate them. There's nothing like that in Judaism or Christianity.
Okay, stay with us, but I want to get some more answers from you and really put my life on the line. Don't go away. Robert Spencer, founder of Jihad Watch, a wonderful author, and I do recommend all of his books. There are many out there. You probably go to websites, because if you try some of the bookstores, there are some that are too frightened and intimidated to actually stock them. In this great time and era and area of free speech, there are people who won't stock certain books. Robert, I want to ask you a question about what happened today. We had a guest on earlier from Jerusalem, the exchange of Shalit for the 500, the first half of 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. I'm not so interested in the geopolitics of the situation right now, but Shalit is this, well, frankly, this skinny little guy who's a conscript, a corporal in a fairly lowly position in the Israeli army. Those who've been released, there are people amongst the 500 who have stabbed female teenagers to death while looking in their eyes, who've killed children, who've killed elderly people simply having dinner, bombed discotheques. Is there not a dynamic in the Islamic world that says, this is wrong, even if it is what they think it's a liberation struggle, to kill children, to kill the innocent? Is there not an outcry within Islam?
No, there really isn't. I mean, you can look around. I monitor the Arabic press and the press in Islamic countries that are non-Arab every day. And I simply do not see this. And I would invite people to send it to me if you see it, but I don't see it out there. The fact is that in Islam, it's a meritorious thing to kill an infidel who's considered to be a kafar harbi, an infidel at war with Islam. And pretty much every Israeli falls into that category. And so there's really no restriction on it, and there's no shame. As a matter of fact, the people who kill Israelis are generally celebrated as heroes. Their posters are up in Gaza and the West Bank on little kids' walls. They get their pictures are traded like bubblegum cards, and they are celebrated.
I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East. I've never seen, ever, in Israeli society, an Israeli warrior. I mean, there are people who are celebrated to a certain extent, but the culture is just anathema to them. If anything, it can be an irritatingly Pacific culture, and almost an embarrassment that people have to go out and fight wars and be brave.
Yes, very much so. And they have tried so many times to make peace. I mean, I think that this Shalit deal is just another indication. I mean, it's preposterous. As you point out, murderers, people who have gloried in the deaths of Israeli civilians, and 1,000 prisoners being exchanged for one. When you know something, this has been done before, and 50% of the terrorists, jihad terrorists that the Palestinians have gotten freed in swaps for Israeli soldiers that they've been holding, have returned to terrorism. One of them, Abbas ibn Muhammad al-Sayyid, he was freed in 96, and in 2002, he participated in another jihad attack, killing 31 Israelis and wounding another 150. He's just one example of very many who've returned and committed mass murder of Israeli civilians after being freed from prison in a prisoner exchange.
Well, apparently the Israelis didn't even ask for the prisoners to not return to terror this time. They realized it was largely pointless. In terms of Islam, beyond the Middle East, though, we all know Muslims in, if you like, the Islamic diaspora, whatever you want to call it, people who live outside of the heartlands of Islam, lovely, kind, generous people, people who have changed my life, who have been so welcoming. Is your argument that they are doing this in spite of their Islamic faith? They would think otherwise.
Well, see, it's a complex thing. It's not that they're doing it in spite of their Islamic faith, but they are doing it while not paying attention to the aspects of their Islamic faith that the jihad terrorists are using to justify violence and hatred and supremacism. There are many things that Islam teaches, and one of the things that it does teach is hospitality toward the stranger, kindness toward people, and so on. But there's a very sharp dichotomy between believers and unbelievers, and generally, believers are not supposed to show the same kindness to unbelievers as they are to believers. As the Quran says, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but harsh or ruthless to the unbelievers. And does that mean that all Muslims are harsh or ruthless to the unbelievers? Of course not, because some people will just be acting like human beings and they will be better than those teachings. But that doesn't mean that those teachings do not exist. There are people who are very serious about every aspect of Islam, people who are very serious about only parts of it, people who call themselves Muslims but don't really care about what it teaches. Just as in Judaism and Christianity, there's a spectrum of belief, knowledge, and fervor.
Just very quickly, what would you say to and there'll be many Muslims watching now, again, decent, good people who love this country of Canada, and they'd feel very hurt by what you've said for the past 10, 15 minutes. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say, then prove me wrong, you know? I mean, the fact is, there are uncomfortable truths, but they're no less truths for being uncomfortable. And the fact is that jihad terrorists do point to the texts and teachings of the Quran and to the example of Muhammad to justify violence and terrorism. And they portray themselves around the Islamic world as the authentic exponents of Islam, and they call peaceful Muslims to join their groups or to support them on that basis, saying we're doing what really ought to be done. Now, that may not be so. They may not be the true Muslims, but then it's incumbent upon the lovely, peaceful Muslims to present a vision of Islam that differs from theirs and refutes theirs and can combat the influence that theirs has in the Islamic world, but they haven't done that yet.
Okay, Robert, we want to have you back on the show. Will you come back?
Always a pleasure, Michael. I'd love to be back anytime.
Great. Thanks for your time, and very important. You keep safe. Thank you very much.
Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. My name is Sophia, I'm your host. The aim of Let the Quran Speak is to help you gain deeper insights into Muslims and Islam as it's practiced here and in other parts of the world. Did Muslims invent Muhammad? That's the subject of a book by Robert Spencer entitled Did Muhammad Exist? an inquiry into Islam's obscure origins. Spencer claims Muhammad was a myth, a political invention created much later to serve the needs of an expanding empire. Are his claims true? Here to assess them, Dr. Shabir Ally, president of the Islamic Information Center. Brother Shabir, what does it mean if Spencer's claims are true? Does this call into question the basis of Islam and Islamic belief?
Yes, of course, in a very big way. If the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not exist, then there's no reason to be a Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the Quran would be one of the most massive fakes in all of history in terms of literature. But of course, his claim is not true.
All right. Explain that. Why is it untrue?
Well, first of all, we should, every Muslim knows that Muhammad existed, and it's common knowledge that there was a man named Muhammad who was the founder of the Islamic religion, even among non-Muslims. So we should now be asking the reverse question: why does this man think that Muhammad did not exist and that Muslims invented him?
Mm-hmm. And are there other people who think that? Because he claims to be building on scholarly sources that exist. So what is he referring
Yes.
to?
In every field of inquiry, there is a mainstream scholarship, and then there is fringe scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
Mainstream scholarship on Islam would include Muslim mainstream scholarship, but it will also include non-Muslim mainstream scholarship. So in other words, among Orientalists, Europeans who have studied the religions of the East and cultures and civilizations of the East, you have a stream of academic scholars who have been studying Islam for a couple of hundred years now. And they have developed a sort of consensus, an idea about how Islam originated and developed and eventually reached the stage that we know now to be Islam. And they generally say that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did exist. He was a historical person, but that Muslims made more of him than he actually was. And they invented things, put things in his mouth and so on in terms of the hadith collections. But when it comes to the Quran, a certain scholar, Theodore Noldeck, from more than 100 years ago, described the collection of the Quran in the time of Uthman, the third caliph of Islam, as basically authentic. And that many different readings of the Quran are known, and they all go back to that core book, which was promulgated in the time of the third caliph Uthman. And this was within 2 decades after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So the Quran is authentic, though not all hadiths are authentic. So the hadith collections would have.
So the Quran isn't something that was invented later on. It was something that, is actually from the time that Muslims claim it to be.
Exactly.
Okay.
So now, so that's mainstream scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, there is a confluence of Muslim and non-Muslim scholarship. The difference is that Muslim scholarship would insist that the Quran was collected not only in the time of Uthman, but even before that, during the caliphate of Abu Bakr, and that Uthman just simply made copies and sent them out to various parts of the Muslim empire. Nevertheless, even if the European consensus is correct, that the Quran that we have now goes back to the Caliph Uthman, to Muslims this is still dependable, because now we have a book which was put into writing by the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because within 2 decades of his death, we have not only Uthman, who was a companion, but Zayd, who is said to have headed the commission to collect the pieces and put them together as the Quran. He's a companion of the Prophet, and this was done in the presence of many, many other known and respectable companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So it would be like the equivalent of saying we have a book which was put together by the remaining 11 disciples of Jesus, and add Matthias to make it 12. So these 12 disciples put together this document, so we know that these are the teachings of Jesus, because the disciples wouldn't lie. They're telling us firsthand what they saw Jesus say and do. So if we have in the Islamic context now something similar, which now the European scholars say we have, a book which was composed by companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, within that early period, then, and they themselves also being careful not to record what they thought and what they would like to write, but to just simply recollect what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught them, and to put them in this book, and this is the book of God, well then to Muslims this is quite dependable, and that's the mainstream scholarship.
So you've mentioned Jesus, and the question is, how does the historical record about Muhammad, about the Quran and Islam, because they're all related, how does that relate to the historical record of other religious figures, perhaps, or of other historical important events?
Well, if we think of the prophet Jesus, then let's think about what Robert Spencer himself describes. He talks about the historical inquiry into the life of Jesus and so on, and he's asking, well, why couldn't we make the same kind of inquiry about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? And he's right. Why should the Prophet Muhammad be excluded from this kind of historical inquiry? We should investigate everybody: the Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Krishna, anyone who is taken to be a revered or a holy figure or an important person to be emulated and followed. Our historical curiosity should take us there. We want to find out who were these persons before somebody made them into a myth or into a hero. So the inquiry, the inquiring, to have an inquiring mind is a good thing. But that doesn't mean that the results of all inquiry are beneficial or dependable. Sometimes people take their research in directions, perhaps sometimes they're motivated by personal interest, which takes them beyond the confines of academic disinterest and neutrality and objectivity. And this is what I think has happened in the case of Robert Spencer. So in any case...
So the question is what we know of Muhammad dependable compared to what we know of other historical figures?
Yes, much more dependable. And he himself in his book admits that the Gospels that we have of Jesus were compiled within 40 to 60 years after the crucifixion. So that means in the late decades of the first century. And you say 40 years for the first and earliest of the four Gospels. That means that for 40 years the Christian community did not have these written documents. So how did they think about Jesus? How did they recollect his words? How did they preach about him? And then Christian scholars generally say that the Gospels as they now are written recollect not only what Jesus said, but how he was being preached about within that 40-year gap. So by comparison, the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, giving us the Quran from the time of Uthman, are giving us not the preaching of the community, but the precise words which they memorized and wrote down from the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So that's very different, because we do not have on record that anyone went about in the early decades of the first century memorizing the actual words of Jesus. And this is why we have often the same words represented in different ways in the four Gospels, because people captured the gist of what he said without memorizing the precise words. So then, why does he think that the Prophet Muhammad is invented? I think this is the most important question.
Yeah, and he points to like biographical information and says that it came 125 years after Muhammad's death. He points to some coinage, inscriptions, things like that don't reference Muhammad. So maybe you can comment on some of those things.
So I started referring to the fringe scholarship. In arguing the matter in that way, he's pursuing lines of argument presented by a fringe scholarship. And more than this, actually, he is putting together a mishmash of ideas that came from various scholars who each in their own way is on a fringe. And some of these ideas, in fact, were abandoned by some of the protagonists who first put out these ideas, and he's still citing them as the authorities behind who stand behind these ideas. Let me give an example. For example, he would say that there is no mention of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, on the early coins which were minted in the Umayyad dynasty. Well, that's true. But what is the reason for this absence of the mention of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? Well, a certain scholar writing in the collection by Angela Neuwart and others entitled The Quran in Context, Heidemann writes about these coins that the early Umayyad caliphs did not find it necessary to produce their own coins. They were just simply using coins that were already available from the Roman Empire. And though they established their own Islamic state, they didn't see that it was necessary to have an empire, an Islamic empire that mints its own coins. And later on, when they will try to mint their own coins, they found from experience that they minted a gold coin, for example, and because it did not bear a cross, it could not become popular among Christians. And they wanted the coins which were already in use and which were already popular. There was no need to change them. So what these fringe scholars are saying now is that look at these coins. They are more like Christian coins than Muslim coins. And that means that Islam as a religion did not really quite exist. And maybe Muslims were a sort of Christian at this time, and Islam would really come later. And when they come up with the idea of Islam, then they would invent its founder, the Prophet Muhammad. But this kind of conspiracy theory requires first rejecting the Islamic evidence and start with a blank slate, and then just coming up with some ideas based on some clues here and there. But we cannot do history like this. You mentioned the biography. Yes, it is true that biographies of the Prophet, peace be upon him, were written some 125 years after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The earliest one we know now, or we have in our hands, is that by Ibn Ishaq, as edited by Ibn Hisham later. But there were also biographies written earlier, at least some compilation of information regarding some of his expeditions, the Prophet, peace be upon him's expeditions, such as by Musa ibn Uqba. And some scholars have done some detailed studies on this recently, such as Gregor Scholler, and they have shown that, in fact, there is some reliable information within the biography. So you cannot just simply throw out all of the biographies. It is true that the biographies contain some later myths and legends and so on as well, which you have to be wary of. But that does not mean that you throw out the baby with the bathwater and you don't take any of the core information. William Montgomery Watt as well has argued along similar lines and showed that, in fact, there must have been some dependable information. When, for example, a battle has been fought and there are slain soldiers, and there are family members now celebrating that we are the descendants of those slain soldiers, and there are many such persons. Now, you cannot discount all of them. There could be some false claimants, but the basic idea that there are fallen soldiers and we are the descendants, that is the basic historical fact. And many other scholars, like Michael Lecker, for example, in the Cambridge Companion to Muhammad, writes that there is a historical core which we can definitely decipher. Robert Spencer also relies on Michael Cook and Patricia Crone. But Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, though advancing some of these ideas in their book Hagerism, in which they first threw out all of the material from Islamic sources and they went with information that they can glean from other such circumstantial evidence like coins and so on, they first advanced this idea that Islam came later and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was invented in retrospect. But they have since then rejected the very idea. And now it is very strange that Robert Spencer are referring to these as the scholars who stand behind this idea. They no longer stand behind this idea. They have discounted this idea.
So to conclude then, Muhammad did exist?
Yes.
And according to many?
According to Muslim scholars and according to the consensus of non-Muslim Orientalist academic scholars.
All right, thank you for that, Brother Shabir.
You're welcome.
We'll take a break. When we return, we will look at the question of martyrdom.